Good evening. My name is Myron Freedman, Executive Director of the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum. The museum presents many programs during the year focused on testimony from a Holocaust survivor or a descendant of a survivor. But I never take for granted or cease to appreciate the courage it takes for survivors and their descendants to share these testimonies. It is an honor to hear from them, and it is also a call to action to continue our mission to reject hatred, especially today during this disturbing period of rising anti-Semitism. Well, we are honored again this evening for this opportunity to listen to tonight's discussion featuring some rare perspectives on a difficult history. And we are so pleased to have so many of you joining us here tonight. Can I see by a show of hands who's joining us for the first time? Wow. Thank you. Thank you for being here. So if you are inspired by tonight's program, we hope you'll return. We hope you'll become part of our museum community. The museum is able to carry out its mission because of our support of our members. So please consider becoming a member, consider becoming a guardian, and those are the ones who make sure the flame of remembrance will always burn bright, honoring the survivors and memories of the victims of the Holocaust. Now, who tonight here is a member? Raise your hand. Thank you. Thank you all. Let's give them a big hand. Yes. One can't turn on the news these days without witnessing more political divisiveness and community division. We are often more comfortable settling into our own silos rather than engaging in courageous conversation that bridge barriers and create connections. That's why tonight's program with Oskar, Jakob, and Suzanne Rico is so important. The singular, monumental horror that was the Holocaust presents a daunting challenge to our comprehension of what defines humanity. Since the Holocaust, museums like ours are constantly looking for opportunities to open windows to a deeper understanding of its causes and effects in an effort to educate and to positively impact the choices people make when treating their fellow human beings. Well, it is our hope this moment will serve as an example to all of us that difficult conversations are more important than ever. And that is one of the many reasons we are so delighted and so grateful to be partnering with Conversation Builds Character on this program. What Dee Dee Simon and Elliot have built is so impressive, and partnerships like ours are more important than ever. So Elliot and Dee Dee, thank you very much. So now to begin our program, let me introduce our moderator. Please help me welcome Dee Dee Simon.
Thank you, Myron. As Myron said, my name is Dee Dee Simon, co-founder, along with my husband, Elliot, of Conversation Builds Character here in St. Louis. We are grateful for this opportunity to partner with the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum to bring you tonight's program. Collaborative partnerships such as this develop stronger relationships that foster a spirit of unity, mutual respect, understanding, and shared purpose. These, in turn, provide a foundation for a strong and resilient community. Thank you, Myron. Conversation Builds Character believes that in order to effect positive change throughout the world, change must first begin in the mind of the individual. But change doesn't happen on its own. It takes courage and a willingness to make tough choices and challenge the status quo. Suzanne Rico and Oskar Jakob are two courageous individuals who, despite the deep trauma and unimaginable pain that divided them, made the difficult decision to expose their truths and learn from one another. By engaging in a higher level of dialogue, Suzanne and Oskar were able to break down barriers and build a trustworthy and meaningful relationship that has had profound effects, not only on the two of them, but also on their family, friends, and community. And their story will continue to inspire and encourage others throughout the country. In partnership with a consortium of Holocaust educators from throughout the United States, Conversation Builds Character will work to develop a teaching resource surrounding Suzanne and Oskar's story that will be made available to all educators charged with teaching this history. Survivor testimony is especially important as it is the heart of Holocaust education. It is grounded in personal truths and provides a unique perspective that cannot be obtained from documents or written records. Today, we have so few survivors among us that are able and willing to share their firsthand account of survival. Understandably so, many survivors simply cannot bear the pain of sharing what they endured. Others, like Oskar Jakob, although extremely difficult, do so willingly with the hope of making the world a better place. Oskar, you are such an inspiration, and we are deeply appreciative for your participation in tonight's program. Thank you. Oskar is joined on stage tonight by his son, Jeff. As a journalist, media, coach, and actress, one can only imagine the shock Suzanne Rico experienced when she realized Nazi descendant would soon be a description used to identify her. A thought that remains very disturbing for her. Suzanne, many people would have kept such a dark family secret hidden. Your strength, courage, and sense of responsibility speaks volumes about the person that you are. Thank you for your vulnerability and what you are doing to help make a difference in our world. Thank you, Suzanne. Here to moderate this never-before-heard conversation of trauma, forgiveness, and hope is Scott Miller. Scott is the former chief curator at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, a position he held for almost 30 years. Scott co-edited The Nazis' Last Victims, The Holocaust in Hungary, and co-authored The Refuge Denied, The St. Louis Passengers and the Holocaust. Scott, we are delighted to welcome you back to St. Louis. Thank you for being here tonight.
Can you all hear me? Great. It's so exciting to be back in St. Louis. Thank you, Dee Dee, and thank you to the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum and to Conversation Builds Character for partnering in this event. I've worked as a Holocaust educator, researcher, and curator for over 35 years. And I've yet to hear a conversation like the one that's in store for you this evening. Much of my time doing the work of Holocaust memory was devoted to making sure that Holocaust survivors tell their stories, both for the expected reasons that survivors must share their stories now while they are still with us, and also to be prepared for the unexpected. There's nothing as moving, inspirational, impactful, informative, and authentic as eyewitness testimony. The conversation you will hear this evening is both unexpected and unique because Suzanne Rico and Oskar Jakob are two people unlikely to share the same stage. Oskar, born in 1930 in Romania to Jewish parents, has lived in St. Louis for over 6 decades. Suzanne, born in 1965, is the daughter of a German immigrant and has lived in California her whole life. Their paths converged after Suzanne began a deep dive into her own family history and found how it crossed over with Oskar's history long ago, deep inside the bleak tunnels of a concentration camp called Mittelbau-Dora. It was there, in the final years of World War II, that Oskar Jakob was forced to assemble a Nazi wonder weapon created by a German aeronautical engineer named Robert Lusser. Suzanne is Robert Lusser's granddaughter. She interviewed Oskar in 2022, which was the first time this survivor and this Nazi descendant ever met. And talk about the unexpected. That meeting was the beginning of a deep and meaningful friendship. Oskar is part of Suzanne's upcoming podcast entitled The Man Who Calculated Death, which revolves around the life of her brilliant, controversial grandfather, a man whose weapon of mass destruction both changed modern warfare, terrified nations, and resulted in thousands of deaths. And this is where we begin. Suzanne, tell us how you began this quest into your family history and how you connected with Oskar.
I just wanted to start by saying when I look out at this audience, I am deeply honored that everyone would think that it was important enough to come here and hear this story. It feels really vulnerable for me because this is the first time that I've really spoken publicly about my family history. And when you have a family history like mine, you worry a little bit how people are going to react. So thank you for coming tonight. I grew up in Cupertino, California, with a picture of my grandfather on the wall with a mathematical equation behind him. And when I asked my mom about him, the most she would say was, well, your grandfather was a genius, which doesn't mean anything to you when you're a kid. So I really grew up not knowing much about my grandfather. And it wasn't until maybe I got into my 30s and 40s that I sort of put together, well, he was a genius engineer working in the 1940s in Germany. He was probably a Nazi. But I didn't want to ask that question. I was not ready to ask it. I was not willing to know. And so I just let it go. I was busy. I was a mom. I was working. I didn't want to go down that road. And then in 2012, my mom was diagnosed, who is my grandfather's daughter. Yes. So her dad was Robert Lusser. She was diagnosed with cancer. And as her dying wish, she asked me and my sisters to finish a memoir that she had started about her German childhood, which was very, very traumatic. So what kind of daughter doesn't honor their mother's dying wish? There was not really much choice for me. And so I started this investigation into my own family history. And what I found was deeper and darker and more controversial and scarier. And I could go on than I'd ever expected. And I found that I really couldn't finish my mom's story until I knew the whole story about my grandfather. And so I started going to Germany. I started going to the places where my grandfather tested his flying bomb. I visited the farmhouse where my grandmother was killed by a mysterious bombing that family legend always had it, that bombing was in retaliation for the deaths that my grandfather's wonder weapon had caused. And I went really, really deep. And when I got all that information together, I thought, what do I do with it? And I started braiding it into
a narrative podcast that tells the story of my family history. And that podcast ended up being called The Man Who Calculated Death. But the thing that I didn't have in that narrative felt like the heart of it to me, and it was what I was missing. And it was a firsthand story of how my grandfather's work was entwined with the Holocaust. And so I started reaching out to Holocaust museums and organizations, mostly in Europe. And I got door after door after door slammed in my face, because the second that anybody heard that I was the granddaughter of the man who made the flying bomb, the V-1 flying bomb, they didn't want to talk to me. And that was like 2 years of time that I was working on this. And finally I thought, I better look in my own backyard. And I started looking around in the United States and reaching out. And I reached out to the St. Louis Holocaust Museum, and all of a sudden a door opened. And they put me in touch with Marcy Rosenberg, and she brought me to this man right here. And all of a sudden, the story that I had been telling had a heartbeat and was brought to life, because I understood then what it was like on the far end of my history, right? So we are diametrically opposed in so many ways. Oskar, he'll tell you his story, but he had 41 people in his family were murdered at Auschwitz. My family had a rough time, but it was not nearly that rough. And so what it did for me was just open up a whole nother vein of dialogue and understanding. And much to my surprise, I think we became friends. I mean, I don't want to talk for Oskar, but it was this incredible connective experience. And that's why I'm sitting here today, because we wanted to continue the conversation that we had in Oskar's living room for a larger audience.
Wow. Okay.
Did I answer the question? Oh, and that's my mom. So this is my mom, and this is my mom when she was 7 years old, and you can see behind her, that's the farmhouse that was bombed and killed her mother. So the farmhouse was hit, they dropped 7 bombs. I can't tell you who dropped them because that's in the podcast. But one of them hit the farmhouse, a direct hit, and my mother was down in the kitchen. So she was injured and had glass embedded up and down her back and legs. But my grandmother was in the attic, and she was killed. And my grandfather was in Berlin working on the flying bomb's guidance system, right? So this was 6 weeks before the war ended. Everybody knew the war was over, but they were still trying to figure out this bomb. And he didn't get back to his kids for almost like 2.5 weeks. So they were kind of living in this bombed out farmhouse trying to get enough to eat. So that was her right before the bombing happened. And this was her right as she was diagnosed with cancer.
Thank you. Okay, now we're going to go to Oskar. We're going to go back in time. So we're not going to immediately talk about or continue to talk about how you connected. But Oskar, before you were in Mittelbau-Dora, as Suzanne said, 41 people in your extended family died at Auschwitz in 1944. Please give us a little glimpse into this, your very personal tragedy, and how it came about, just the deportation. What happened?
May the 4th, 1944, we got a loud knock on our door, and there was 2 Hungarian policemen telling us that we have 2 hours to pack, and we're going to have to leave and take along certain things, belongings that we may need for about 2.5, 3 weeks. Needless to say, there was total confusion in our house, but we started to get ready to enter this journey. And once we were finished, they came with our own horse and buggy and rounded us up into the next town where my grandparents lived. And from there, we were rounded up and go into a ghetto, which was an open field in Romania. And the only thing you could see in this field was a railroad track, and no buildings whatsoever, just a railroad track. And after 2.5 weeks, we see a train coming in, all boxcars, and when the train stopped, we were loaded between 85 to 90 people in each of the boxcars. There was men, women, and children, and some babies. And the train started rolling, and it took us about 2.5 days till we arrived to Auschwitz. Once we arrived in Auschwitz, at that time we had no idea what this place was or what's going on. And we were forced out of the train, and able-bodied people was forced to go to the right, and women and children and old folks had to go to the left. And since I was only 13 years old, one of the prisoners who was there before me, he realized that I was a very young person, and he asked my age, and I tell him that I was 13 years old. He said to me, "Do not tell them the truth that you are 13 years old, because all children under 15 ended up in the gas chamber." So when it was my turn to tell my age, I told them that I was 17 years old. And that's how I managed to survive Auschwitz.
But let me just ask, if you could maybe, I know this is very hard for you, but maybe perhaps, I know you lost 41, family members, but to talk maybe about your cousin Judy.
My cousin Judy from Prague, Czechoslovakia, that was my mother's sister who lived in Prague, and they were fleeing Czechoslovakia just the day before the Nazis marched in. And when they were fleeing, she called my mom and asked her if she could take care of her baby because she was only 6 months old. And she didn't think that she would survive the where they had to go on, through borders and guards, and they decided not to take the baby along. And my mom agreed to keep this little baby. She was 6 months old. And needless to say, when we arrived in Auschwitz, she was with us, and Mom carried her on her arm into the gas chamber, including my brother and my sister.
And this picture, when I was interviewing Oskar, and after we talked, he brought up this picture. It just felt like the whole thing became even more real, in that you look at this little girl and what was her crime? There was nothing that she deserved and your mother deserved, and that impacted me so strongly, this story about cousin Judy.
Yes. So Suzanne, you never, obviously you didn't know about your family connection to Mittelbau Dora. So maybe just for a few minutes talk about how you discovered it, sort of the technicalities. You shouldn't take it. None of us should take it for granted what you did. And I'm imagining it was a little bit intense.
Yeah, this was one of those moments where it's deeper and darker than you ever thought, in both the figurative sense and the literal sense. When my sister and I decided to go over in Germany and follow our grandfather's path, we didn't know about the true cost of his weapon. We thought that the the British and the Belgian, which was thousands of people who died in London and in Belgium, we thought that was the true human cost. But then we found out about Dora Mittelbau, or Mittelbau Dora. I'm not sure which one it is, but I think both work. And we immediately decided that we had to go there and see it for ourselves. We arrived on a gorgeous, and by the way, the Mittelbau Dora concentration camp was where the Nazis moved their production facilities after the other production facilities in the north of Germany were bombed by the Allies. So they needed a secret place that they couldn't see to make these weapons. So we got there on a beautiful spring day, and the flowers are blooming and everything is green and gorgeous. And all of a sudden we're walking into the small crematorium, which Oskar, had to go and pile up bodies in this place. And then we were scheduled to go on a tour into the tunnels. And this is one of the times in my story where I just wanted to stop. I did not want to go. I wanted to go back to the rental car. I wanted to drive away, go have a beer, and forget about this whole thing. But that would have been the easy path and not the true path, the one that I had to, my own odyssey, right, as a person. And so we went into those tunnels, which are 8 degrees Celsius and dark purposefully. So they've kept them sort of purposefully the way they were, although obviously they've been so cleaned up. And we're walking through these tunnels, and all of a sudden I got to a little catwalk where I walked up and I looked down and I thought, what is that? What is down there? And I'm looking and I'm thinking, is that buckets? Is that what? I couldn't figure out what it was. And then it dawned on me that those were the pieces of my grandfather's flying bomb from 70 years ago. And it was all the scraps of metal that they had thrown into this trench. And so that's a picture that I took, and that's what I was looking at. And I think that's one of the changing points for me in understanding the human tragedy that I was somehow caught up in. Was this connected me to the worst part of the Nazis, which was the Holocaust, right? And all of a sudden, I realized that I wasn't just connected to science or to the bombing of London or any of these things. I was connected directly to those tunnels at Dora Mittelbau. So yeah, it was a very personal and difficult moment for me, but I'm so glad that I did it, because if I hadn't seen that, there's no way that I could have understood Oskar's journey. And I won't ever know what it was really like in there, but I have a better understanding of it now.
I realize it was very emotional for you, but you're an exceptional Holocaust researcher. I have to say,
Thank
after
you.
working in this field.
This is part of that part of it, I think, is worth mentioning, because it's a fascinating process, right? I mean, none of us in this room, maybe a couple of us, will really ever understand what World War II was like. Certainly not my generation or your generation. And we will never understand what it was like to fight in those conditions, to work in an underground tunnel. I'll never understand what it was like to be a 7-year-old girl in a farmhouse where she went to be safe, getting bombed. And this is as close as I'm ever going to get. So the history and the research was hugely satisfying for me, because I felt like, okay, I can't be there, but I can get as close as I possibly can. So thank you.
You, Oskar, So when Suzanne first contacted you, you didn't know all this amazing research she did. Were you a little skeptical?
Yes, I was. Excuse me. I didn't know who she was, but I depended on my good friend, Marcy Rosenberg. She wouldn't bring me somebody that I wouldn't want to talk to. But as more and more I heard about Suzanne and talked to her, and Jeff, my son, talked to her quite a few times, I realized that she is genuine. And I was very relaxed to really sit down and talk to her.
That's wonderful. And when you did sit down and talk about your shared history, was there a moment that you were angry?
No, I was not angry at her. Once I knew that her grandfather was involved in Dora, in the working on the V rocket, I realized that she had nothing to do with what her grandfather's generation was involved in. So there was no reason for me to be angry or any Germans that was in her generation. They have no responsibility what took place during the Nazi regime.
Right. I'm sure many people ask you, as they do many survivors, do you hate all Germans?
No, I do not hate all Germans. I don't like to talk nice things about the generation of Germans who was living under the Hitler's era, because they were very strong supporter of Adolf Hitler.
Okay.
When I have to say that Oskar might not have been angry at me, or blamed me, but I didn't know that when I was going into it. I only had Marcy's assurance that it wasn't going to be a disaster. But I was so nervous. I was jumpy like a cat. And again, I wanted to turn and run. That was my instinct, is what are you doing? And I wouldn't have blamed him if he was angry with me or just angry. But when he opened the door and he just had this big smile and this welcoming attitude, and I knew at that point that it was going to be okay, and that he was not going to judge me for what my grandfather did.
So let me ask you, Suzanne, what's about your opinion about generational guilt? Oskar doesn't hold that, but your opinion on generational guilt and responsibility, and also how your mindset has changed as you figured out your family history.
Well, that was another kind of eureka moment of asking myself that question of whether I had any generational guilt or responsibility for what happened in World War II 20 years before I was even born. My sister and I, when we went to Germany, the first stop that we made was the house in Augsburg that my grandfather designed and had built, because he was a genius. And we knocked on the door, and it's really nerve-wracking to knock on a stranger's door in a country that you don't live in. And this woman came to the door, and I have this in the podcast. I think it's a great moment for kicking off the personal journey, not the physical journey of going through Germany, but the personal journey. And we started talking to her and telling her what we were doing, and she said, "Oh, I know who your grandfather is." And we were like, "Whoa." She already knows how the history of her house intertwines with the history of her country. And then we started getting into it with her a little bit, and she's the one that first brought the subject up. And I thought, whoa, this needs a little bit more deeper dive on my part. And what I have come up with, and I don't know if this is a good answer or not, but I can only do what I can do to atone for that history. I can't go back and change it. Nobody can. So what do you do when you can't go back and change the past. You have to do what you can in the present. And that was one of the major motivators for me to talk to Oskar, because I wanted to apologize to him for my family's part in what he went through. And it wasn't something that I thought would actually make a difference, because what is one apology for 41 people in your family being murdered and being stuck in 3 different concentration camps? But I think it was meaningful. It turned out that it was. And I guess that is what the responsibility, like guilt, I don't really feel guilt, but I felt this responsibility, and I still feel this responsibility to say I'm sorry again and again, as many times as it takes for me to make that difference with as many people as I can. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, Oskar, of why it was important to you, because the reason blew me away.
Truthfully, you were the very first German that I know that actually apologized to me for what happened to me and to my family and altogether the Jewish people of Europe. And I really appreciated that, and I think I tip my hat for you for that.
Well, thank you. And you know I meant it from the bottom of my heart. And it boggles my mind, and I think that this is a much bigger subject that needs discussion, is why those 2 words are not used more often. And I think it is because maybe my mother's generation, they didn't even want to talk about it or deal with it. Like, it was so harsh and horrible that maybe they couldn't. I mean, my mom in her memoir, she doesn't really deal with her father's Nazi connection. I deal with that in the podcast because I had to grapple with it. But I think in a way it was still too hard for her. And I understand why, because it was hard for me. But the fact that nobody until me had ever said, I'm just so sorry, is negating the power of an apology and saying, I am so terribly sorry for what you went through.
Thank you both. So Oskar, I want to ask you something. It was a little surprising to me what I heard in a sort of a sneak preview of Suzanne's podcast, which is when it comes out. I was about to say you couldn't put it down. I'm a product of the first 65 years of my life. I mean, you couldn't stop listening to it, and it's really amazing. But something you said that in some ways you understood the work and the decisions of Suzanne's grandfather, Robert Lusser. You even said that you defended him somewhat, meaning putting into context for Suzanne, what he did, being an aeronautical engineer working in the Nazi regime. Do you think about Lusser, or especially that sort of Suzanne brought him back in a certain way into your life?
Once her grandfather joined the Nazi party and involved himself into being an engineer of these V-1 rockets, there was hardly any possibility for him to step back and have changed his mind, because the punishment would have been very severe, if not worse. So he almost had to go along because we're talking about a brutal dictatorship of the Nazi era. So, but it's speculation in my part that took place.
Well, I think it's what was so important to me about that is that you sort of underlined something that I had been struggling with, which is it's very easy to sit here in this chair or in this room and armchair quarterback and second guess. I mean, the value of hindsight, it makes everything pretty clear. And of course, I would like to think that I would have made different choices. I would like to think that I would not have joined the Nazi party. I would like to think that I would have said no, or at least maybe moved out of Germany. I mean, he had that choice. But then when you put your feet into somebody else's shoes and you try to go back to that era, which is what the point that Oskar was making, and you say, okay, I've got 5 children. I'm the sole support for a family. I am an aeronautical engineer, and the only way I can make money now, because the entire aviation industry by 1935 or 6 was war-centric, right? It didn't have to wait until 39. They were already building up the Luftwaffe long before that. So when you do that, and I'm a mother of 2, I thought, if it would at all endanger my children, maybe I wouldn't have been that brave person. And maybe I wouldn't have risked my life and my children's lives. And indeed, my grandfather was at one point brought up on a war crimes trial by the Nazis they accused him of designing faulty airplanes and doing sabotage and treason. And so he was fighting for his life for about a year, because if he had been convicted, the best he would have gotten was a concentration camp. So I think it's, for me, to have Oskar give me even a little bit of understanding for that time and the choices that my grandfather was facing, that was, I felt like that was a gift.
You would have called it a lesson in humanity.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I felt like it was. I mean, if Oskar Jakob can have any bit of humanity for my grandfather, I think that is the best of what we can expect. And there's my grandfather here. So this is in 1942, when he was in charge of the project to build the flying bomb. And I don't have another picture, but if you could see the difference in him from 1937, when he actually also designed the BF-109 warplane in the mid-30s. That was his first project for the war effort. He has aged so much here. So this was after his year-long war crimes trial, and he was eventually acquitted. And then he got the flying bomb project. This is his first Knight's Cross that he was given for creating or running the project that built the BF-109, which, by the way, is still the most produced fighter plane in history. So if you can separate for a minute his brilliance from his government, he was a brilliant engineer. But then I look at this and I think, ugh, you know, this is the medal that he got for that. And I don't know, was he proud of it? That's something that I can only speculate about too. I'm not proud of it.
So, Oskar, you know, we all know, especially people here in this room who've gone through this magnificent exhibit here at the Holocaust Museum in St. Louis, we all know the power of survivors telling their story and the importance. What do you think is so important about people like Suzanne telling the story of her grandfather, who's someone who was a member of the Nazi Party, who was a Nazi, who collaborated with the Nazi regime?
I commend Susan for doing the work that she's doing, even though she had to expose her grandfather to what was taking place in Germany at that time. I'm sorry, repeat that again.
So the importance of, you know, Suzanne telling the story of her grandfather.
I'm not following you.
You said to me today, maybe this will bring us onto a different dialogue, but today Oskar and I got to tour the museum together, and you said to me, which I thought was so lovely, you said, I wish there were 1,000 Suzanne Ricos.
That's right.
Telling stories like this. And I just thought that was amazing and worth asking you to explain.
That's right. I said that, and I repeat it again. We need many, many Suzanne and Ricos to do what you are doing, and to educate people, because we have so many naive and ignorant people that they have no idea what went on in the Second World War, especially with people that was murdered by the millions in the concentration camp. And by the way, it wasn't all Jews, it was others, gypsies, homosexuals, and mentally ill people. They were all murdered just with the Jews altogether. And to expose this kind of crime, the worst that the world has ever seen, it is important to have people like Susan Rico, and I commend her for it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. If any one of you in this room did the deep dive into your family history that I did into mine, you would find things that would blow your mind. And you might not find that your grandfather was a Nazi, but you would find things that are incredibly interesting. And one of the things that I found was that I had a connection to one of the groups that was persecuted by the Nazis. I don't want to spoil it for you because it's in the podcast, but I never expected that. And I had to, it was like all of a sudden I was on both sides, you know? My ancestors on one side had been persecuted, and on the other side, they had been the collaborators. And then my husband is Jewish, and I found out something about his family, that his larger family, like Oskar's, was lined up in Lithuania in front of a mass grave and shot by the Nazis. And I found that sitting next to my husband. Luckily, he has a decent sense of humor, so he didn't kick me out. But it was, it was one of those things where we're like, oh my God, like, go back into the past and our destinies and our histories collide in World War II. So I would encourage everybody to take a look at your past, because what you find it's probably worth the effort.
Yeah, so, Suzanne, there's a lot of, heavy stuff in your family history, to put it mildly. I think there's heavy stuff, if we all, as Suzanne said, if we all do some deep diving, but as you said, probably most of us won't find out that our grandfather was a Nazi. Yeah. So let me just ask you, do you have any, regrets about this whole project? And what's it like? You said, people refer to you as a descendant of a Nazi.
Yeah, that's a kind of a kick in the teeth, like I said, I didn't grow up with this knowledge in my head. So the first time that I ever heard somebody describe me as a descendant of a Nazi, I was sick to my stomach. And that was just recently. And it was here in St. Louis. And, for a quick second there, I thought oh my goodness, how do I put the genie back in the bottle? No, I don't want to do this. And then I thought to myself, okay, truth, right? If that is the truth, you need to say the truth, even though in my podcast and in the book that is going to come out with the podcast, which is my mom's memoir that I finally did finish, I think it puts a lot of context around it, because it's not just black and white, right? It never is. But did I ever wish that I stopped doing the project? No. But there is a lot of soul searching and kind of staring myself in the mirror and saying, I don't like this label, but I have to learn to live with it. And the whole story brought me to Oskar. And so I would never go back and do it any other way.
Okay. Oskar, in a second, I'm going to ask you a little bit about Mittelbau-Dora. You already spoke about Auschwitz. But before I do that, I'll just say that you're 93 years young. and you're one of the last survivors of Mittelbau-Dora, perhaps, as you said, perhaps the only one. It can't be easy to relive those years, relive your childhood and that whole experience. You could have easily have said no to Suzanne. You know, you realized she was a lovely person and you had a lot of trust, but still you could have said no. It was such a difficult thing to go back to. So I guess I'm asking, why did you say yes?
I said yes because the more we emphasized what happened in the Holocaust, the better, because there's so many young people naive that they have no idea that these horrible things had taken place. And that goes for Jewish young kids, that they absolutely don't know there was a Holocaust. So as far as I'm concerned, the more we expose it and talk about it, if we can educate even a few hundred people, I was willing to do that.
Yes, Oskar, you are the you are the best way to fight Holocaust denial. Just people meeting you and hearing your story. So I do want to ask you more about being. I know it's a tough topic. Being at Mittelbau-Dora. What was, if you could describe maybe the nature of the labor that you did and the conditions and just what transpired?
We were working in 2 shifts, 12-hour shifts each. One week I was on night shift, the next week I was on day shift. And we received 3 potatoes for 24 hours. That was our diet. And in the factory, in the tunnels, I was given a machine that I had to produce approximately between 450 to 500 rivets. And sometimes I was so tired and hungry that I wasn't able to produce that many rivets. So if you didn't reproduce 450, the minimum, you got a beating. There was an SS riding back of me with a truncheon, and it hit you, give you about 6 hard hit that you think that your back is breaking. So I did that every day while I was working in the tunnel. I'm
going to jump just. I think it was in Auschwitz. You had told me when we were speaking, maybe this is a spark of hope of humanity in this sea of darkness. About, I think it was a Romanian SS guard and the food and.
It was only one time and one time only where a SS guard realized that I was born in Romania and I was a young person, and he started talking to me in Romanian. And after I spoke to him for a few minutes, because he wasn't allowed to speak to a prisoner like me, but he did, and he actually gave me a slice of bread that I always remember, even as I'm 93 years old. I can never forget that slice of bread because I was so terribly hungry.
I was just going to talk a little bit about going into the tunnels where Oskar was working in 2016. And it's so dark and cold in there, and the condensation drips down from the ceiling, and so you're getting like these droplets of rain. And with the tour guide that we had, who was in German, so I was kind of following along with her, and we came to this area where the wall was sort of, you could see that they had filled in the wall, and it had a 44 on the wall. And I said, well, what is this? And she said, oh, that was the work cavern where they made the V-1 flying bombs. And it was, I mean, that was so incredible. And by the time Oskar had gotten there, they had moved the prisoners into barracks above ground. But before they did that, those prisoners had to live underground as well as work underground and sleep underground, and they never saw the light of day again. And 20,000 prisoners out of 60,000 people, a third, died either in those tunnels or as a result of them. So, I mean, this just goes back to trying to imagine it. That's as close as I could get with the rain kind of coming down on me and thinking about those prisoners living there and having that condensation falling on them in the however many hours they got to sleep before they were put back in the tunnels to work. It's mind-boggling.
You were, I believe, in 3 or 4 camps, and if you can say, what was, I guess, the most difficult or the most despairing for you between Nordhausen, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, Dora?
The 3 camps that I was in, the worst was when we were forced to leave Dora and ended up in Bergen-Belsen. That was the worst because we were already so emaciated and we were weak when we arrived in Bergen-Belsen. And when we arrived, you could see dead bodies at the gate already that was there and died from hunger and thirst. And we walked further in, and everywhere we walked, there was dead bodies. So we were hoping that this is the place where we're going to get a little bit better ration, and it didn't happen. We weren't given any food once we arrived in Bergen-Belsen. In Bergen-Belsen, I did not receive a slice of bread or a potato for 3 weeks in a row. And that's when we were just desperate and we thought we were going to die from starvation. So I was scavenging around and on my knees and hands because I couldn't walk upside. And I noticed that something is sticking out of the ground. And I get closer, and it's a hoof of a horse. And I couldn't believe my eyes. And I went closer, and I went back right away to talk to my cousin, Irvin. And I told him what I found. I said, you must come with me, and we're going to try to dig it out and see if we can cook it and have something. And he did come, and we got there, and we got one of these that the SS cut off the top of a can because we had no tools whatsoever, and started digging, and we had to be careful because there was other prisoners, especially Russian and Polish prisoners. If they would have seen it, they would have discovered it. We wouldn't have had a chance to do what we were actually doing. So Irvin and me, we finally dig this horse hoof out just to the first joint, and we managed to cut it off, and we brought it back to where the barrack was, and we started making a fire, and we cooked it for hours. And when we looked on top of the water and we saw a little fat, we actually smiled and we said, we're going to have some soup. And we cooked it, and when we finished cooking, there was no meat on that horse hoof except just warm water, maybe a little fat. God knows how long that hoof was in the ground. So when we saw the fat swimming on top of the water, we smiled to one another, and we ate that. And next day we cooked the bone again and again and again. And one day it was nothing on the bone anymore. So that was the end. And people were dying left and right. We couldn't stay in the barracks because the stench was so bad. So we started sleeping outside, and there was dead bodies everywhere. Everywhere. When I lay down outside next to the barrack, I was not more than 4 or 5 feet from a dead body, because when the British liberated us, they found 28,000 dead bodies just on the ground of Bergen-Belsen. And they couldn't burn the bodies because the crematorium was a small one. So what they did is they used a bulldozer and dug mass graves. And when we went to Bergen-Belsen with my family, we saw that the largest mass grave was 8,000 people, and another grave of 5,000, and another grave of 2,000, and it goes on and on. Some graves only had 500, and that's how they buried the dead. And I actually have pictures that the British took after they liberated the camp in Bergen-Belsen.
Can you, I'm sorry, I shouldn't jump in, but I'm a journalist, and I just have to ask you to describe your liberation and what you felt at that moment when you knew that you were going to make it, because I know it was very close that you would not make it.
We didn't want to believe that these were British soldiers or American soldiers. We thought it was Germans at first, but about half a day later, one of the half-tracks makes a turn to the gate and just knocked down the gate and drove into the camp. And there was microphones on the camp, and the British started to announce in many languages that as of today, April 15, 1945, you are freed by the British Army. And needless to say, you would think that we would be so happy that we would be dancing for joy. There was no strength of anybody even to get up on their own feet. People were just starving to death. And I felt like any day that it's my turn, because a whole month went by and we didn't get any food, any ration in Bergen-Belsen. So that's about the story about Bergen-Belsen.
Yes, 30,000 prisoners died in Bergen-Belsen in the month after liberation from weakness and
well, they died
starvation.
Because when they received, we received a loaf of bread that the German Wehrmacht was receiving from the government, and the British baked this bread, and everybody, that was the very first piece of food that we got in weeks and months. So some people took this bread and ate the whole bread at one time. And what happened is, the following day, they died from eating the bread. And so many people died that we thought that we were being poisoned. But what happened is that they were unable to digest the food because they haven't eaten for so long. I was lucky, and my cousin Irvin and my dad, we talked to one another, don't eat the whole bread, just eat part of it and save it for the next day, because we were afraid we're not going to get nothing the next day. So luckily we made it alive.
So I'm going to jump ahead to happier times. You came to the United States, settled in St. Louis, and built a great life here with wonderful family members, many of whom are here tonight. But then at a certain point, you went back as a family to Brau, the town you lived in, and you retraced the steps of this horrible story that you told us. And I just saw some photos of it. What was that like? What was the low point of that for you?
It was my oldest son's idea to go back because he was interested in see the camps where I was incarcerated. So I agreed, and we decided to go back, and we decided to trace the route from the small town that we lived in Dobro, and from there we went to Auschwitz, And by the way, we drove. And from Auschwitz, we went to Nordhausen, Dora. And from there, we went to Bergen-Belsen. And it was a very difficult journey. It was heart-wrenching, but I'm glad we did it. And I'm glad my sons had the experience to see what their dad went through and our people.
Amazing, amazing. Wow. So, Suzanne, you've been working on this project for more than 5 years. Aside from meeting Oskar, what's been the most, positive thing about this experience and searching for your own history?
Well, Oskar was definitely the most positive.
Second most.
Second most. I think it's hard to truly understand who you are and where you are until you know where you've been and you know where your family has been, because I feel like my eyes have opened in so many ways. And one way that I can describe is the understanding of my mother and what her problems were as I was growing up. She would have these terrible panic attacks, and she would like run out of the store during a shopping trip because she would be overwhelmed. Or we lived in Northern California, where one of the Moffett Field is, right? So sometimes these old warplanes would come flying over the valley, and that would spark her terror, and she would go into these like, she couldn't breathe, she couldn't swallow. And I was a kid. I was like, Mom's freaking out again. We don't really know why, and we don't really care. And then when I started learning more about her experiences, I felt like I got so much more understanding of her as a person and not just as a mother. So that was a huge silver lining to this. I also feel like as human beings, we like to put things in categories, and we like to make things black and white, good and evil, right? Those are the easy categories to say somebody was truly evil or somebody was truly good. But what I think I've learned is that there's so many shades of gray with all of us, right? We've all done things that we're very proud of. We've all done things that we're not proud of. And in looking at not only my grandfather, but my grandmother, the choices that she made as a woman in the 1920s and the 1930s, and as a mother and somebody who was not educated, and what her life was like, that's super meaningful to me, because my grandmother died in 1945, long before I ever got to meet her. But yet now that I've looked into this history and I've found out so much more than I ever dreamed of, she's come alive for me. And so these are the things, these connections that you make when you start doing the hard things, these unexpected gifts that come, like Oskar and his whole family have become very treasured to me. So there's been a lot of beautiful moments. My sister and I have gotten so much closer because we took this journey together. And like, we were always kind of close, like sisters are, but now it's like we speak the same language. We are there for each other, and we both had a dawning that the problems that we have, those are handleable problems. The ones that Oskar was dealing with, and people like him, or even my grandmother, stuck in that situation, those were the real problems. And so it's given me a perspective that I never would have had if I hadn't undertaken that journey.
Thank you. It's beautiful. Oskar, Suzanne is talking about, her mother, keeping the memory of her mother alive. What would you like us to know about your mother? What do you think about?
My mother was the most beautiful, kindest human being that I have ever known. She was a sweet person. When we went back to Dobro, and our neighbors that used to be our neighbors in Dobro, they would come over and meet us, and they asked me how my mother was. They didn't realize that she was already murdered years ago. So I told them that she's no longer with us. She was murdered in Auschwitz. And then they made comments that what a wonderful human being she was. And I know that that's what she was.
So when you shared your mom's picture with me and this story, it made me think about my mom too, because she died in 2013. She fought valiantly for 9 months, and then she died. And the only way that I could keep her memory alive truly was to tell her story. And I came across a quote as I was doing this, and I'm probably going to mangle it, but it's something about how there are 3 deaths. And the first is when your heart ceases to beat. The second is when your body is consecrated to the grave. And the third is when nobody remembers anymore to say your name. And that's what I think Oskar is referencing, is he will never, ever forget her and telling her story and showing her picture and showing my mom's story and my mom's picture. It's a way of keeping people that we've loved and lost alive. And that's been the mission of the Holocaust Museum and people that are working in that across the world, is to keep that memory alive so that we know where we're going in the future and we can stay away from where we've been in the past. Oskar, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Okay.
When I was with you in 2022, I asked if you would say a Jewish prayer for me, or just a prayer. I would take any prayer. So I'm going to ask one more time if you would give us the Psalm of David.
Yes. I'm going to say it in Hebrew. Mizmor leDavid Adonai roy leachsar binush deja yarbitzeini al maimoni chosyanalaini navshu yeshavai yechani b'margot tzedek leman shamoy gam ki yelech b'gait salmuves lo yiru ki yatimudi shiftecho im shamtecho heimu yinachmini taroich lefunai shilchon neged zor roy the shamte b'shem in the roy she kol siruayu ach toivu chesed yidefini kol yamei chayam v'shavte b'veis Adonai la'orech yomeim.
So that's for all the people that we've loved and lost. And I appreciate you sharing that prayer and your life and your story with me.
Thank you.
Oskar speaks about restoration, forgiveness, peace, and hope for the future. We live in a world where that has been ignored. We must build better character. And on the note of character, I'd like to conclude by referencing this evening's sponsor, Conversation Builds Character. The goal of great conversation is to open one's mind in order to hear, understand, appreciate, and value other person's perspectives. May Oskar and Suzanne's conversation serve as an example to all of us what can happen when we achieve higher levels of dialogue. May we find lasting solutions to injustice and intolerance and seek the common ground of human dignity and respect. And now, Helen Turner, the Director of Education here at the Holocaust Museum in St. Louis.
My goodness. Thank you so much, everyone. And I am here to give the thank yous. My name is Helen Turner, and I'm the Director of Education. And I have to say, I've sat in many rooms for testimony. I've heard many stories, and I'm truly moved by what we heard tonight. So I stand here in gratitude and in awe of our speakers, Oskar and Suzanne. Thank you for your presence, for your vulnerability, and for your incredible courage. The world needs more conversations and friendships like yours. Thank you so, so much. We owe this incredible connection to Marcy Rosenberg, who brought them together and supported them through this process. Thank you so much, Marcy.
Yeah.
I would also like to offer a special thank you to Scott for joining us for this important conversation and guiding us through this difficult topic. Thank you for your grace. And to the museum team who worked tirelessly to bring this all to life, thank you so, so much. I know that each of us here will never forget this experience. And I really want to express my sincere gratitude to the museum's partner, Conversation Builds Character, Dee Dee and Elliot. We cannot thank you enough for the incredible work of your organization. And ultimately, you are true champions of Holocaust education. Thank you. And I promise my final thank you. Thank you to all of you for being here tonight, for bearing witness to being part of this story. We would not be here without you. We sincerely hope that you join our community to keep conversations like this going, and we are in immense gratitude to all of you. So we do have some upcoming programs if you would like to join us again, but for now, we thank you, we hope to see you again, and we wish you safe travels. Thank you.